Welcome to another Gray Sheet educational podcast. I'm Sean Schmidt, editor-at-large. Once again, I'm joined by Cap Uldriks, a former FDA official who is currently head of Encore Insight, his very own consulting firm. Cap is here today to unveil his 12-step plan to recovering from Form-483 inspection observations after the FDA investigator goes home and you're left to, pardon the pun, your own devices. Thanks for being with us today, Cap, which I might add is your fourth visual podcast with the Gray Sheet. So welcome back.
Well, thank you for having me provide the podcast, and I want to welcome everybody who's tuning in to what I find to be a fascinating subject as an ex-FDA investigator. So first, let me put this into context in terms of how I want to approach this. 483s are a place where when you receive a 483, you really don't want to be in that situation. So what are you going to do to get out of that situation? So let's pretend that an investigator has just finished visiting your facility and they discussed the 483 at the end of the inspection. And for those of you who aren't sure what a 483 is, it's the inspectional list of observations, which identifies the apparent violations of applicable FDA legal requirements. I say apparent because it's simply the investigator's view that may not be true. They could make a mistake, but it's the apparent violation. So when you receive the 483, there are three fundamental steps you need to take. One, you have the 483 in hand, so admit you have a problem, at least from FDA's point of view. Going into denial, especially at the meeting when you're talking about it with FDA, is not helpful. You just need to accept it for what it is. So once you realize you have the problem, then you have to fix the problem, and the sooner you do that, the better. And then if you realize that you aren't capable or you don't quite get it in terms of fixing the problem, you need to seek out some credible help. The assumption there is your own self-help program hasn't quite been successful. So that's sort of the context. You have a problem, you need to fix your problem, and you want to check out how you were able to do that. So let's go into the first step of a 12-step recovery program for FDA 483s. First, you have to respond. This is really important because FDA is fussy about this. You have to respond to the 483 within 15 days after the 483 was issued to you. And FDA expects to have that response in their hands on day 15. Sort of an amusing side point, if you say, well, the response is in the mail, that's sort of like the check is in the mail, or the response is almost done, or more famously, my dog ate it. FDA is not going to accept those kinds of excuses. Maybe in school, but not now. So the other important thing in terms of dealing with the 483 right up front is ideally you've had a pre-established plan for how the firm is going to respond. So you have issues like who's going to respond, what are you going to say, when are you going to say it, and how are you going to say it. All of those are very important. So first, in terms of who's going to be responding, you should have a manager identified in your firm who's going to look at the 483 response, keep it organized, and meet the deadlines. You just sort of need a major administrator for that. When you have a pre-established plan, you're going to develop who should be participating in the response. It really should be a corporate-wide input into the response. And I especially want to point out that it needs to include the sales department because a 483 is usually going to be distributed to your customers by your competitor. That happens a lot. So your sales department needs to have sort of a script or an understanding of what they should say to your customers to try and clarify or get the situation back into reality so your customers don't get scared or upset. That's your face-to-face situation with your customers. Also include, this is really important, analytical, engineering, or clinical professionals. You're going to have two levels of the response in the same letter. One is basic conversation or basic information, but then you have to have technical professionals. They will be trying to speak to the other professionals or technical people in FDA. So we sort of set up that you've got to get the response in the mail within 15 days for FDA. And I would use a signed receipt program or a courier service to do that. And then you need to figure out how you're going to respond. But they have a contact point, corporate-wide input, and then your professionals. So that sets it up. That's step one. Let's go on to step two. So now you've got your plan set up. Let's look at the response itself that you're going to do. When you're drafting your response, you should sort of organize it, well, you should organize it the same way that the 483 is organized. That just makes it easier for the FDA case officer to follow what's going on. So when you say the first observation regarding observation one, and then you simply repeat the observation. Why? You want your document to speak for itself. If God forbid you end up going to court, you want your document to say this is exactly what the situation is. Here's FDA's position, here's our position. That's why you need to recite the observation. So observation one, our response to the observation one is as follows. And then whatever you want to say, we have corrected blah, blah, blah. And regarding observation two, recite the observation. Our response to observation two is as follows, blah, blah, blah. So that's your basic organization of your response. So that part probably is pretty easy. It's more of an editorial kind of thing. So going on to step three, another factor is when you're drafting your response, you have to make sure that the receiver at FDA is going to understand it. So that's an issue of comprehension. So your introductory statements for each observation should be written in a clear and concise way so that the layperson can understand it. For example, a software engineer may not be able to understand what the microbiologist is concerned about. So you need to set things up so everybody who's going to look at your response gets a feeling or gets an understanding, basic in nature, to understand where you're going with it. And then you're going to get into more particular information. So your general introduction, so anybody at FDA can understand how you see the observation. And then in the second part, write that at the professional level to explain your how you understand the technical problem from your point of view and how you're going to fix it. The reason I say that is that when FDA is looking at your response, there are a lot of people who are going to look at it. You know, some with medical training, some with engineering, some with microbiology, et cetera. And some of them don't have that. They're just worried about how is the regulation capturing the observation and vice versa. That's not technical, that's legal. So let's go on to the step four in terms of you've drafted your response and you've written it in a way that FDA can follow it and understand it. Now you need to talk it out. So you've set up how you're going to do your response. During the inspection, the FDA investigator has talked about the different violations they think they see. So during the inspection and at the end of the inspection, you need conversations with the investigator. Make sure that you understand the issues that the investigator is concerned about. Also, did you say what you would do about the issue? So this is what I hear you saying, FDA, and then privately, what am I going to do about the issue right now? We need to make a decision behind the scenes about what we're going to do. And included with that is how are you going to prevent it from happening again? One issue with FDA is correcting something and preventing something. You can clean up the floor, that's correcting it, but then preventing it from happening again, you need to have a schedule and an audit to make sure people are doing it so it doesn't happen in the future. Fix it, then develop a process where it doesn't happen again in the future. You also need to remember during an inspection, in terms of talking it out, anything you say is fair game for the investigator to include in their inspection report. So also when you're conducting the inspection with the FDA and you say one thing during the inspection, but then you say something else in your written response, that's not a good thing. It's contradictory, and someone at the FDA can say, you know what, they don't even know what they're doing themselves. Not a good situation. Let's go into step 5, which then, in terms of talking it out and what you've said, One important issue is what kind of promises did you make? Make sure that whatever you promise, you can actually do. It's sort of amusing when a firm promises that, gee, we have faulty sterilization validation. So they'll say, we'll fix that in a week. Well, you can't fix it in a week. Everybody except yourself apparently knows that you can't. So FDA, again, is going to say, you don't even understand your problem and you don't get it. So don't let your promises shoot you in the foot. When you do make a promise, FDA expects you to complete each promise. If you don't, you're going to be in an uncomfortable situation. So make your promises modest. And then if you can go beyond that, that's great. So how I look at it is it's better to promise a Ford, but then deliver a Jaguar, which I'm sure we all would love to be delivered a Jaguar. So let's go on to step 6. Now that we've dealt with the promises you've made, so you've kept your promise. That's what step 6 is about. If you've kept your promise, you have to prove it to FDA. So in your written response, you have to provide that information and documentation regarding each 483 item. On the follow-up inspection, FDA will verify that you corrected everything you said you would. And breaking your promise in terms of that situation is not a good thing. FDA has a particular way of classifying that. So you fall into the situation of becoming a chronic violator, and you're just repeating the same things again and again. So in terms of not keeping your promise. One thing you want to do to make sure you've kept your promise, and you haven't done, a good job up to this point, you may think about getting a third-party inspection to help you out to verify from an independent point of view that your corrective actions are really successful and complete. So let's go on to step 7. So now that we have to submit proof. How are we going to start? We have big observations and we have little observations. Well, one of the things I learned, at least at FDA, is when you've got to make some corrective actions, take care of the easy stuff first. At the same time, you're working on the long term, but it's not going to be fixed right away. So if we have an observation that's sort of narrow in scope, like you didn't sign this particular form, or this procedure to skip this particular point, that's easy to correct. In fact, in some cases, you can do it during the inspection, and at the end of the inspection, you can say, we fixed that, and here's what we have to show you. And the investigator is going to put that in the report. So that works greatly in your favor. So, easy to fix. Make sure you start with the easy ones so FDA thinks you're taking it seriously. With that, let's go on to step 8. Step 8 is concerned about how you manage your response with FDA. It's important to understand that FDA is going to want to talk with one person. Why? And the firm should want this too. While you don't want duplicate conversations, person A and person B both talking to FDA. It's confusing to FDA, and they have no assurance that you two are really saying the same thing for the same reason. Use one contact person. One of the problems that also happens is you have one person saying yes and another person saying no. It's contradictory conversation, or it's inconsistent. You don't want to have that happen with FDA. Why? Because you don't get it if that's what happens. The other thing is you need to have one person make sure that you're delivering everything to FDA that you said you would, and in time. One thing that's important to understand is time deadlines that you can set for yourself. I promise to get this done by the end of 2 months. Make sure you do that. If you miss it, FDA is not happy with you. You also want to avoid confusion within your firm about who's going to be responding to FDA. I've seen more than once where a company, is not prepared to respond to a 483, and everybody gets involved, and everybody's in a panic, and the thing sort of falls into a Mad Hatter's Tea Party. That's not the way to respond. You need to have a pre-planned, organized process for doing that. The other thing in having just one person involved is that it really increases your credibility, because FDA can at least take the position that, it's being organized and one person's telling me consistent kinds of responses. And it also develops a trust factor. FDA gets used to dealing with that one person. That's a good thing. So, dealing with one person and you're trying to fulfill your promises. Let's go on to step 9 when we talk about the actual timeline that you're using. Some problems take a long time to fix, and other ones you can do in a fairly short span of time. When you're discussing your corrections or preventive actions with FDA, lay out your timelines. Your timelines in this case are self-imposed. If you're responding to something and you can say you're going to fix it by next week at this time, make sure you've done that. If you're saying it's going to take 2 years to fix this and here's why, and it's reasonable in terms of FDA's view, then do that. So you can see that FDA is going to be watching what you do. And again, I want to emphasize that it's your timeline that you've put into the mix. And so make sure you keep that. If anything, give yourself a little wiggle room. When you don't meet that timeline, particularly if it's like one thing after the other that you haven't met, all you're doing is inviting FDA to come in and doing an inspection because they're not sure that you're really doing what you're promised to do. So go in and find out what you haven't done. That's FDA's position. Make sure you meet the time deadlines, sort of as a deterrent for FDA. So let's go on to step 10. So you've gotten everything into FDA. Now here's the sad news. You need a reality check. You may have written a wonderful response to the 483. I can recall one response to a 483 that I thought could have been a doctoral dissertation, the perfection of a response to a 483. Unfortunately, they still got a warning letter. In fact, worse things happened than that. So here's the thing: is you can provide, a diamond in the rough, or even a diamond. FDA may still treat you as a lump of coal because what they found at the time of the inspection is what they're going to make their decision on, not simply your response to the 483 if it's really bad. So FDA's enforcement trigger also is going to be based on the risk to health posed by the product. So if your product, because of observations, looks like it's going to possibly really hurt someone, then FDA is more likely to take an enforcement action. And the way you can figure that out is to look at recalls that have happened for your type of product and the recall classification. If your kind of product has been involved in a Class 1 recall, you know that FDA is looking at that device with great scrutiny, also with Class 2 recalls. So that's important to look at that. And FDA's way of doing a health hazard evaluation and risk assessment is never in your favor. So let's go on to the next step, step 11. So you can say, okay, we fixed these things and FDA may still go after us. So how are we going to make amends to FDA for all of our wrongdoings? Well, based on the 483 observations, you may decide on your own assessment of prior recalls with somebody else that you need to conduct a recall. So recalls are a public process. The public's going to know what the problem is. And the reason for the recall, i.e. your problem, is going to be made public. FDA publishes all of that kind of stuff. Make sure that you can get that presented in a favorable light in terms of doing due diligence and abundance of caution and all that kind of stuff. FDA may not agree with how you phrase them. They may want to talk to you, but there's no reason to shoot yourself in the foot about what you say about the recall or the reason for the recall. Try and be as neutral as possible about it. Don't try to sell FDA in terms of the good thing you're doing with the recall. That never works. And be prepared to work with the FDA when you're conducting your recall. That's all handled through the district office in terms of the progress that you're making, and the district office or the field office is going to be talking with the center during that process. The center that's involved with you, the Center for Devices, and the field person are going to be working together. So you're really dealing with two people. So finally, let's go to the last step, step 12. Damage control. So you've gone through all this, you've done what you were supposed to do, you had a brilliant response, but the thing is, it's not only in your hands. The 483 is a public document, and some of your competitors may give a copy of your 483 to your customers. And they may say, look at what happened to the person you're doing business with. They're in violation of FDA law, and they're going to, spin it in a way that's not in your favor. So when you know that's going to happen, competitors are going to put it out there. You need to make sure your sales and marketing staff have accurate information and a script for how they're going to respond to that. Or if you're having a recall, the customers are going to ask about what's behind this recall. Your sales staff and your marketing staff need to have some sort of points or issues to consider when they're talking to the firm. You don't want your sales force or marketing staff making up their own story. That does not fly. Another important thing is, however they answer, whatever they say needs to be truthful and non-misleading. That can get you into problems again when you say bad, untrue things or misleading things about your product. FDA is going to say you just misbranded your product again. So you don't want to do that. And then the other thing, just out of abundance of caution, if you have FDA problems, my suggestion is that you look to see if those problems also overlap with another federal agency. And I'm going to list these here because it's been done and I've referred things to these people. The Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, Federal Communications Commission, OSHA, and EPA. In fact, there's a regular routine procedure for FDA investigators to do that. I also did it when I was at the Center for Devices. In fact, I have routine communications with those groups of people, especially SEC. So we've gone through 12 steps of recovery, so you have sort of a basic plan on what to do. And good luck. Hopefully you don't get a 483, but if you do, at least here's sort of a basic guideline in terms of steps to get out of trouble. Thanks.
Thanks for the wonderful presentation, Cap. We always learn so much from you. And thank you at home, the office, the car, or wherever you're listening. And as always, you can check out our full line of podcasts at thegraysheet.com.